Hello everybody, this is my method for designing and sewing fitted bodices without a dress form. Here's another top I've made with this method, but this tutorial will be focusing on how I made the pink one. I'm using 1.5 yards of fabric, and I recommend using a fabric that kind of holds its shape. And I'm using 1 yard of 1/4 inch boning. If you don't have boning, you could also use zip ties. And then you're going to need no more than a yard of elastic. I'm using 1/8 inch elastic, but 1/4 inch would work as well. And then to help design the pattern, I'm using pattern making tape. But any other kind of thin tape would work for this. You could also probably cut up normal tape to make it thinner. And then you're also going to need muslin to help design the pattern. But any kind of cheap, thick fabric would work for this. I've used an old bedsheet and it worked fine. I'm wearing a cropped fitted t-shirt for this, and you could also wear a long one, but it's probably a little easier if it's cropped. To make it tighter, I'm tying the extra back with a ponytail, and I also ended up using a few clips. Then I grabbed the pattern making tape and marked the center. And then I marked where I wanted the bottom of the bodice to be, which for me was my waist. And since the top is symmetrical, I'm only going to draft the pattern on 1/2. And then I marked the neckline, and I'm only really worrying about the exact neckline in that little quarter area from the center to the side, but I'm pulling the tape all the way around just to make sure it's tight. And then I marked the side of the bodice and split that region in half. And I forgot to mention this, but you definitely want to be doing this in front of a mirror. So now that I have my taped regions, I'm going to cut the muslin into little manageable squares and start pinning it to my shirt. I'm placing my pins on the outside of the tape, and I'm pulling the fabric to make sure it's entirely flat within the taped border. So once I was done pinning and the fabric laid flat in that first taped region, I went over with a pen where the tape was. It can be kind of difficult to figure out where the tape is, so I recommend doing this in a well-lit area so that you can kind of see through the fabric. You can also kind of follow along the lump underneath the fabric that the tape creates. So once I'm done tracing over with pen, I move the pins from outside the shape to inside the shape so that they don't get in the way when I cut away the extra fabric. Now it's time to cut away the extra, and I'm not really worrying about exact seam allowance at this point. Then I repeat those steps for the other piece. And I like to pin the two muslin pieces to each other as well as to my shirt, just to make sure that they fit together nicely. And just like the other piece, I marked where the tape was with pen and cut away the extra. And here are the two finished pieces. I've learned to not bother trying to do my back. I did last time, and the pieces were way too messy and it just wasn't really worth it. For the most part, your back can just be simplified to a trapezoid shape. So to get measurements to create the back, I placed another piece of tape on my side, trying to make sure it was in the same exact place as the other one. I measured from tape to tape at the bottom and also at the top. Yeah, and then ideally you don't want the measuring tape to be twisted like mine was, but yeah. And the last measurement for the back is the length of the edge of the side piece, and I'm only going to be measuring the red line so I don't include the extra fabric. And then again, since it's symmetrical, I'm only going to need half of the trapezoid, meaning I'm only going to be using half of the top and bottom measurements. And then to help sketch the trapezoid, I recommend solving for the height with the Pythagorean theorem. And then I'm going to split the shape in half again. One piece will just be a rectangle, and the other piece will have a diagonal edge which will match up with the other side pattern piece. I then shifted the rectangle over by 1 inch so that I could cut both pieces with 1/2 inch of seam allowance. Next, I moved on to creating pattern pieces from the two muslin pieces. I began by cutting along the red line, getting rid of all the extra fabric. Then I placed it on a sheet of newspaper and traced the edge. And that metal box and pins are just there to help keep the fabric flat. I cut it out with 1/2 inch of seam allowance, just like the back pieces. I followed those steps for the center piece as well, and to avoid a seam in the middle of the bodice, I sketched it out once and then flipped it and sketched it again so that the center was all in one piece. And just like the other pieces, it has 1/2 inch of seam allowance. These are the 4 complete pattern pieces for the bodice. All the pieces will be cut twice except for the center piece, which will only be cut once. I cut out all the pieces using my metal box to make sure that the pattern pieces laid flat. To begin sewing it all together, I attached the front side pieces to the front center piece. Since I'm sewing all my pieces together with a French seam, which works great for covering up raw edges, I'm only going to use up half of my seam allowance the first time I sew them together, so that's 1/4 inch. So once I'm done sewing them together for the first time, I cut away the extra so that I only have 1/8 inch of seam allowance left. And then while it's facing the right side, I fold it over at the seam and iron it flat. Then, to complete the French seam, I sew it together again using up the last 1/4 inch of my seam allowance. I iron it again, fold it over, and then I pull the fabric out and iron it over to one side. I repeated those steps for attaching the back side pieces. And what can get tricky about a French seam is that the right side and wrong side end up getting switched. So even though these two pieces are facing the right way, I'm still going to connect this piece with the raw edges facing upwards. And finally attaching the back center pieces with French seams as well. To make the big puffy sleeves, I cut out two pieces of fabric that were 24 inches by 19 inches. I folded it in half so that it was 12 inches by 19 inches and sewed it together along the long end with a French seam. However, I left about 5 inches on one end that wasn't sewn together. And to figure out how much I needed to gather the fabric at the bottom of the sleeve, I measured around my forearm, making sure that it could fit over my hand easily. And to figure out how much fabric I had to take in, I subtracted that measurement I got from my arm from the circumference of the bottom of the sleeve at this point. And then I pinned pleats going all the way around. You could measure out where you want to place each pleat, but I just decided to eyeball it. I sewed the pleats down, only sewing about 1/8 of an inch from the edge. To create bias tape, I cut a long 2-inch wide strip. First, I ironed it in half. Then I ironed each side into the center. Then I ironed it in half again. Then I pinned it around the bottom of the sleeve to cover the raw edge. When I got to the end, I made sure to fold it in on itself to cover its own raw edge. I sewed close to the bias tape's edge, but not too close because I wanted to make sure I was also sewing on the part that was folded underneath. I think the bias tape gives it a nice finish, but you could also just do a rolled hem. To finish the sleeves, I hemmed the top part twice to cover raw edges and create a channel for the elastic. I cut 2 pieces of elastic that were 11 inches long. To get the elastic through the tube, I like to attach a safety pin to one end, and then it's a lot easier to guide it through with my fingers. Once I get to the end of the elastic, I sew it down to anchor it, and then I continue pulling the elastic through until I get to the other end. Once I get to the other side, I take the safety pin off and sew it down again. The last part of the sleeves is hemming that V area right there, so I hemmed it twice to create a rolled hem that would protect the raw edges. And it looks a little wonky right now, but we're not going to see that part once we attach it to the bodice. But before I can attach the sleeves, I'm going to sew a rolled hem along the top of the blouse. At this point, I tried it on by safety pinning the back together to figure out exactly where I wanted to place the sleeves. I decided to line up the end of the sleeve with that seam between the back side piece and the back center piece. When attaching the sleeve, I just pinned along that little V, kind of stretching it out to make it a straight line. And I sewed it together just before the rolled hem so that I wasn't sewing over so many layers of fabric. And depending on how much structure you want, you can place the boning in all of the French seams, or if you want a little less structure, you can do less. The only 2 places that you definitely need boning would be the side seams and the ends on the back. For now, I'm just going to do the side seams, and I'm cutting them about 1/2 inch shorter than the actual length because I want to leave enough room to create a rolled hem on the bottom. Once I cut one piece, I just use that exact measurement to cut the other piece so that it's symmetrical. If you're struggling to get the boning through the tube, I recommend rounding off the edges with a pair of scissors. To create the open back, I decided to get rid of about half of the last back piece. I measured it to make sure that I was taking in the same amount on both sides. However, I added about 3/4 of an inch to that measurement I wanted so that I could create a rolled hem. So then I sewed my rolled hem, just making sure that the last time I folded it over, I had enough room to fit in another piece of boning. Then I inserted pieces of boning into both ends, again making sure that it ends about 1/2 inch before the bottom. Now that all the boning is in place, I can finally hem the bottom. So I'm folding it in about 1/4 of an inch to create the first part of the rolled hem, and then folding it in again to finish it. And if you must, you can sew over the boning. I just don't know if it's good for your sewing machine. Just do it manually so that you don't snap the needle. And to keep the pieces of boning at the ends from slipping out, make sure to sew back and forth at that top part that we hemmed earlier. Finally, to create the lace-up part, I'm going to cut a bunch of strips that are 1.5 inches wide. One of them will be really long. This one will be used to tie it all together. Mine was about 68 inches long. Next, you're going to need a bunch of 3-inch long strips. These will be used to create the loopies that the longer one goes through. You can choose how many you want, but I'm using 10, 5 for each side. And lastly, you're going to need 2 strips that are 2 inches longer than the length of the edge of the back. These end up looking nice and decorative, and they cover up the raw edges that the loops create. I'm folding all of them over and sewing them to make the tube a little bit thicker than 1/4 of an inch. I cut away the extra so that it's down to 1/8 of an inch, and then if you have a loop turner, use it, but you could also use a safety pin to turn it inside out. To do that, I attach the safety pin to one end and then stick it into the tube. I pull the fabric over the end of the safety pin and then continue guiding it through. And here are all the strips once they've been sewn together and turned inside out. To finish the long strip that will be used for the lacing, I used the ball of a pin and tucked in the edges and then sewed them shut. And then to figure out placement for the loops, I used a ruler to create 5 evenly spaced dots. I made sure that the first and last one were very close to the edges. So after marking the first and last ones, I filled in the 3 middle ones. To create the loops, I folded over the shorter strips and then pinned them down so that that seam was facing downwards. And I'm working on the outer facing part of the fabric right now. As I pinned, I decided on how much of the loop I wanted sticking out, and I was just going to cut away the extra later. I sewed them down about 1/4 of an inch away from the boning. And then I cut away the extra, leaving about 1/8 of an inch. And of course I did this on both sides. Once those were done, I ironed the medium-sized strips flat. And then leaving 1 inch extra on the top and the bottom, I pinned it down to cover the raw edges of the loops. I sewed it down on both sides, sewing very close to the edge. I cut away the excess so that I had about 1/2 inch left, and then I folded it over once on itself and then over the edge so that I could sew it down and hide the raw edges. All that's left to do is to thread the long strand that we sewed earlier through the loops, and then the shirt is complete. So that takes you through my entire method from the very beginning. I hope you enjoyed it, and I definitely recommend playing around with this and drafting different kinds of bodices on yourself, because it's so fun once you have a pattern for one that fits you perfectly and you can just make it again and again as a building block in different dresses and shirts. Hope this tutorial was a good first YouTube video, and please leave any suggestions for any kind of improvements I can make in explaining things, and also if you have anything you want me to make next.